Starting off this hour with some breaking news out of Baltimore. We begin with a judge and his decision now handing out the verdict in one of the cases against the Baltimore police officers charged in the death of Freddie Gray. Officer Edward Nero has now been found not guilty of assault, conduct, and reckless endangerment. Officer Nero, one of 6 officers in Baltimore charged in the death of 25-year-old Freddie Gray, who died in April of last year, setting off a series of protests in that city. Let's go straight to our reporter on the ground there. NBC's Ron Motti joins us live now from the courthouse in Baltimore. Ron, the judge now just handing down this verdict of not guilty in this case. The officer and his attorneys choosing to not have a jury hear this case. What's the very latest from the ground there?
Hey there, Tamara. Well, a lot of folks are going to say that this is not particularly surprising because a lot of people thought of the 6 officers who were charged in this case, that the case against Officer Nero was probably the weakest from the state's point of view. He had very limited physical contact with Freddie Gray. His attorneys argued last week in court just about a minute and a half or so. He touched him to retrieve an inhaler that Freddie Gray said he needed after he was detained and then arrested. Now, the state argued all along everything that followed after that point was invalid and illegal because the state contended that that was an illegal detention, that the police officers hadn't properly established a probable cause for chasing him and detaining him and then ultimately arresting him. Of course, he was placed into that van. He was strapped, tethered to the legs, but was not strapped in by a seatbelt. Ended up breaking his neck and died a week later, and that touched off riots across this city the week after Freddie Gray, the days after Freddie Gray passed away. Now, in the days leading up to this announcement this morning, Maryland Congressman Elijah Cummings is asking people to respect the verdict and to remain calm. We do hear helicopters overhead. Now, there was a small group of about maybe just under a dozen people out in front of the courthouse today. We'll have to see now over the next few minutes or hours if people start to stream downtown here or go to that area of Baltimore that saw most of that unrest here a year ago, April. But again, he is not guilty on all cases. A lot of the analysts, Tamara, will say this is sort of a playbook, if you will, for the 5 cases now to come. He opted for a bench trial versus a jury trial. Officer William Porter, who was tried at the end of last year, that jury deadlocked, and so there was a mistrial declared. He will be back on trial sometime in September. So now we've got 5 more cases to go. One other interesting thing, Officer Porter, who was the first officer who was set to trial, he is going to testify, presumably, against his fellow officers. The last few months, the state and his attorneys have been arguing about whether the state can compel him to testify against these other officers because the state believes he's a strong witness for the state. Tamara?
In Officer Porter's trial, his manslaughter trial ended back in December with a hung jury. As you pointed out, he's got this retrial. It's set for September 6th. But going back to this verdict today, as you've noted to many legal observers, this may not be a huge surprise. But this goes back to, Ron, the decision made by the state's attorney, the state, to charge all of these officers who had varying degrees of interaction when following the arrest and the events that led up to the death of Mr. Scott. But here, just looking at what the prosecution said here, they're saying that that Nero did not have probable cause to arrest Mr. Gray and failed to put a seatbelt on that shackled him in the police transport van. That's the role they allege that he played in this case of Freddie Gray's death. The defense attorney tried, as you also noted, to minimize Nero's role in the arrest. They said, for example, that he did not touch Gray, that he touched him only once, and that the defense argued that the officer followed his training. So this goes back again, Ron, to the very beginning. The question was whether or not all of these officers should be charged. And at the time, the state stood by its decision, as controversial as it appeared.
Well, there were a lot of people who, when these charges were announced, thought that the state overreached by charging all of these officers, and some with some very serious offenses. The 4 counts against Officer Nero were all misdemeanors, including that second-degree assault charge, which carried up to 10 years in prison. And the question is, who had the chain of custody? Who was most responsible for Freddie Gray's safety in that police van? He was not strapped in, and if you talk to a lot of policemen and policewomen around the country, that has generally been the case probably before this case, maybe there will be some changes across the country in law enforcement and how they handle the transfer of prisoners. But he was not strapped in, and he went on that ride and, of course, suffered those severe injuries. Officers have some leeway, some legal protection to do the job of police work, which includes detaining people, arresting them in cases where probable cause can be established. The state argued that there was no probable cause ever established here, and so that everything that happened to Freddie Gray was in effect illegal and exposed these officers to some criminal liability, Tamara.
And also at the time, Ron, and we've talked a lot about this, the idea of not strapping in Mr. Gray and taking him on this ride, deliberately, accelerating and braking. That was a part of the allegation and how he sustained some of those injuries. Again, this is, of course, the video that many of our audience have seen time and again since 2015, the initial arrest of Freddie Gray. Then he is put in the back of this patrol wagon here, and what happened after that led us to where we are right now with 6 officers ultimately charged in his death. Now you've got a hung jury, and you have another officer in this case now found not guilty. But going back to these charges, Ron, and it seems as if the state, the prosecution, will have to come out now and explain why they pursued this avenue with the possibility of, again, a not guilty verdict here and a hung jury on the first one with a retrial coming up.
Well, this is clearly a blow to the state, Tamara, because now the other 5 teams, legal teams that are preparing to defend their clients, now see what they might consider a successful playbook, which is rather than opt for a jury trial, get a bench trial with Judge Williams, because now you can see what he at least thinks about this particular officer's role in this case. And some people will say that this officer, again, was the least culpable, if you will, of all the 6 who were charged. And the spotlight really is on the driver of the van. That's Officer Goodson, Caesar Goodson. He was set to be the second officer to take trial. His trial was delayed until next month because of some of the legal battles I mentioned earlier between Officer Porter and the state about whether Officer Porter can now be compelled to testify against the others. But again, Tamara, a lot of people who follow law enforcement around the country thought this was a dramatic overreach by the state to charge so many officers in connection with Freddie Gray's case and his ultimate death. And a lot of people think that the one who perhaps, if anyone, is culpable is Officer Goodson, who was, I talked to a retired officer just a moment ago who spent a lot of time in the Baltimore Police Department, who says that the wagon man, his term, is responsible for the transport of the prisoner. So that would be Officer Goodson in this case. The 3 officers who were there at the arrest, including Officer Nero, as we know, Officer Nero now has been absolved of any criminal wrongdoing. The 2 other officers will have their trials later in the year, Tamara.
Ron, going back to the reaction from the people as they hear this verdict, give me an idea. You've been there talking with folks and anticipated the possibility of a not guilty verdict here. What are they expecting in Baltimore?
Well, I mean, I think if everyone is listening to the esteemed Senator, Congressman Elijah Cummings, we will expect some calm here today. Obviously, there will be some folks who are disappointed and may think that this is going to be just the first of many acquittals to come. But there was only a small handful of people out front in the courthouse to hear these verdicts. A different scene than we saw back in December when Officer Porter, the first person to take the stand, or to go to trial, I should say. There were many more people here, a lot more active outside the courtroom. The entrance to the courthouse is back on Calvert Street, so I believe we might have a shot down that street with one of our different crews, but it's a much different atmosphere here, Tamara. I don't suspect that we will see trouble because I think a lot of people thought, as they have followed this case, reading the local media reports, that this officer was the minimal involvement in this arrest of Freddie Gray.
All right, Ron, let me go to MSNBC Chief Legal Correspondent Ari Melver. And Ari, the representative or the attorney representing Officer Nero said at the time he and his client discussed the pros and cons of foregoing a jury a million times. They decided, in fact, to leave his fate in the hands of a judge here.
Right. The reason that is unusual is when you have 12 people trying to make a decision and they need to be unanimous, those are generally pretty good odds. That's why defense counsel usually advise people to take a jury trial. The issues here, though, were technical and turned more on the law than the facts. What I mean by that is basically you had an argument from prosecutors that if the arrest itself was unlawful, right, if there wasn't a reason to arrest Freddie Gray in the first place, then anything that then happened itself was a crime, that the arrest or the contact incidental to the arrest, the physical contact between the officers and Mr. Gray on the street, we're not talking about in the van yet, was itself a criminal act, and that's why you have the second-degree assault charge. I will just say that is unusual because that's not typically how unlawful arrests are dealt with in Baltimore or anywhere else. Typically, the punishment for a totally unlawful arrest would be basically keeping any evidence out of trial of that defendant and or punishing the officer administratively. That is, oh, you didn't do a good job at work, not criminally, not taking them to court. So everyone saw this legally as a stretch on that count.
Well, you know, it's interesting that we say everyone saw this legally as a stretch, the prosecution obviously feeling differently. When you just look at, for example, the misconduct or reckless endangerment, we know from the injuries, Freddie Gray was not strapped in, was not seat belted into the back of that patrol van. It would not be his responsibility to strap his own, body into the seat there. So it would be the argument from the prosecution that someone was responsible, someone may not have directly took his life, but their actions from the false arrest or the arrest without cause to the issue of how you place this individual in the back of that patrol vehicle.
Prosecutors made that argument, but to make it, they really had to argue that there was sort of a broader, concerted effort here, or what legally we would sometimes call a conspiracy, although that wasn't the formal charge. The problem with that, with regard to Officer Nero, who we're learning here is acquitted on all 4 counts today, the problem was he wasn't directly physically involved in that. He was involved in the initial contact and the arrest. Now, again, let's be clear. Part of the reason this was so controversial was that, according to prosecutors and later documentation, Freddie Gray was not found to be committing a crime, was not found to have contraband on him. He did have a knife that prosecutors say was legal, and that never even came up in this case. So there is plenty wrong with the scene when you have someone who isn't basically evincing the behavior to have a lawful arrest, and then they are put into a situation where they then die, and you have a question of who's responsible for that. So I think all of those are very important questions. Indeed, that is why legally some of the other cases are seen as stronger, because you have the officers directly involved in putting him in the van without a seatbelt, which was required under ordinance, and in driving the van in what was often called a, quote, rough ride, what people have heard about, where it's not transportation. It seems to be using a vehicle, according to prosecutors, as a means to hurt someone when they are in your custody. If you can prove that, that certainly is assault and illegal. But again, with regard to what we're learning right now about Officer Nero, you have a judge basically saying that he didn't think the prosecutors carried the burden, that the nature of the contact over the arrest amounted to a crime.
And Ari, what we also know is Officer Nero's partner, that's Garrett Miller, testified that he was the person who actually detained Gray. The state compelled him, Miller, to testify. He's awaiting trial, to stand trial against Nero, and he was granted apparently immunity. His testimony cannot be used to incriminate him at his trial, so which is something we've talked about from the very beginning. How much of the case against each of these officers will come from their partners, will come from other officers who were there?
Well, and that goes to A, how factual are people in their statements when they are also obviously trying to put their best foot forward in their own defense, and B, is there anything above and beyond the testimony here that would underscore the prosecution's theory of the case, that this was deliberate misconduct to hurt someone? I think there has been a thicket of problems regarding the testimony. Obviously, that has delayed the trials. I do think it's important to understand for folks watching at home that when you have separate trials like this, each one is supposedly separate, which means that Officer Nero, in the eyes of the law, may have been found today to be acquitted, and other officers who may have been physically or directly involved may not. As for this larger strategic question that I think people are discussing of whether you want a jury or a judge, I think it really depends on the case. I will tell you, we will see, but it would be a more difficult call for the folks who drove the van to avoid a jury trial, because there you just need one holdout.
Ari, I've got a statement, and thank you, from the mayor of Baltimore, Stephanie Stephanie Rawlings Blake. Her statement says today Judge Barry G. Williams found Officer Edward Nero not guilty of all criminal charges. This is our American system of justice, and police officers must be afforded the same justice system as every other citizen in this city, state, and country. And now that the criminal case has come to an end, Officer Nero will face an administrative review by the police department. We want again ask the citizens to be patient and to allow the entire process to come to a conclusion. In the case of any disturbance in the city, we are prepared to respond. We will protect our neighborhoods, our businesses, and the people of our city. Again, that's the mayor of Baltimore, Stephanie Rawlings Blake. I want to bring in with the conversation community activist and Professor Lawrence Brown from Morgan State University in